British families in the 1970s trusted these cars with everything, and at number 2, one saloon was so poorly built that jacking it up wrong could pop the rear windscreen clean out of its seal, while people were still sitting inside. Stay to the end for that story, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. Number 10. Hillman Avenger. The Hillman Avenger arrived in 1970 with more confidence than almost anything else in the Roots Group's lineup. It was styled to look American, with a Coke bottle waistline and a wide stance that made it look bigger and more expensive than it actually was. Roots marketed it as a fresh, modern alternative to the Ford Cortina, and for a brief window, it sold well enough to justify that ambition. The trouble started quietly, in the places families never thought to check. The rear axle mounting points were prone to corrosion far earlier than anything comparable from Ford or Vauxhall, and once that corrosion set in, the handling deteriorated in ways that felt genuinely unsafe on wet roads. The 4-speed gearbox, adequate on paper, felt notchy and imprecise in daily use, and buyers who'd been sold on refinement found themselves wrestling with it at every junction. Interior trim faded and cracked within a couple of British summers, and the door cards had a habit of coming loose from their fixings entirely. Dealers reported a steady trickle of warranty claims that never quite added up to a single dramatic scandal, which in some ways made the problem harder to fix. There was no one catastrophic flaw for engineers to isolate and correct, just a long list of small compromises that added up to a car families stopped trusting after the second or third unexpected repair bill. It wasn't catastrophic. It was worse than that. It was quietly disappointing, month after month, in a way that eroded trust without ever producing a single dramatic failure. Number 9. Austin 1300. The Austin 1300 should be remembered as one of the great British design triumphs of the decade. Instead, it's remembered as a warning. Built on Alec Isagonis's brilliant transverse engine, front-wheel drive layout, the same fundamental architecture that made the Mini a legend, the 1300 offered genuinely class-leading interior space and a hydroelastic suspension system that gave a ride quality far smoother than rivals twice its price. Critics adored it when it launched. Families queued for it, and for good reason. Nothing else at that price point felt so cleverly engineered. Then the hydroelastic fluid began leaking, softening the ride into a wallow that undercut the very thing the system was supposed to deliver. The automatic gearbox option, fitted to a significant number of family-spec cars, proved fragile and expensive to repair, often failing well before 60,000 miles, at a time when a gearbox rebuild could cost more than many owners had left to spend that year. And the underbody, never properly protected against British winters and road salt, began rotting from the inside, hidden beneath carpets and trim until a routine service revealed the sills were barely holding the car together. By the mid-1970s, independent garages had started warning customers outright before a purchase, lifting the carpets during a pre-sale inspection because the rot so rarely showed on the surface. Owners who'd fallen in love with the packaging and the ride quality found themselves quietly betrayed by a company that had nailed the engineering and then failed at the much simpler task of keeping water out. A car engineered brilliantly on a drawing board had been built by a company that couldn't protect its own genius from the weather. Number 8. Vauxhall Magnum. The Vauxhall Magnum was supposed to be the car that finally made Vauxhall's engineering feel special again. Launched in 1973 as a more powerful, better-trimmed version of the Viva, it came with genuinely impressive overhead cam engines and sporty badging that suggested Vauxhall had rediscovered some ambition after years of playing it safe. What buyers actually experienced was a car built on an aging platform that couldn't fully support the extra performance bolted onto it. The front subframe transmitted vibration into the cabin at a level contemporary reviewers openly criticized, turning motorway journeys into something closer to an endurance test. Fuel consumption on the larger engine variants was brutal, arriving right as the 1973 oil crisis made every mile at the pump feel personal to families already stretching their budgets. And the body, shared with the humbler Viva beneath the badging, rusted from the wheel arches inward with a speed that made the sporting image feel like a cruel joke within 18 months of ownership. Resale values collapsed faster than almost anything else in this class, which meant families who'd stretched their budget for the badge often lost the most money when they came to trade it in. Families who'd paid extra for the prestige badge found themselves owning, underneath the paint, exactly the car they'd tried to avoid buying in the first place. Would you have noticed the warning signs before it was too late? Many owners didn't, not until the bill arrived. Number 7. Wolseley 18 of 85. Part of British Leyland's sprawling landcrab family alongside the Austin 1800 Morris 1800, the Wolseley 1885 was pitched as the sophisticated, well-appointed version, leather trim, a walnut effect dashboard, and the illuminated Wolseley badge on the grille that generations of British buyers associated with quiet respectability and a step up the social ladder. The respectability didn't survive contact with reality. The transverse engine layout made routine maintenance a nightmare for local garages unfamiliar with the design, driving up running costs for ordinary families who simply wanted an oil change without a specialist's invoice. Body panels were famously heavy and awkwardly proportioned, giving the car a reputation for cumbersome handling that undercut its otherwise comfortable ride. Worst of all, water ingress around the windscreen and door seals was so common that owners in damp regions of Britain reported carpets that never fully dried out between autumn and spring, leaving a persistent, musty smell that no amount of cleaning could shift. Owners who'd chosen the Wolseley specifically to project a certain image found that image undercut every time they opened the door to a damp interior in front of a neighbor or a client. A car meant to signal that a family had made it, instead became a slow, damp, expensive embarrassment sitting on the drive. Number 6. Leyland Princess. The Leyland Princess deserved better than what it got, which somehow makes its story more frustrating rather than less. Launched in 1975 with genuinely striking wedge styling, the Princess looked years ahead of anything else on a British street. The Hydraga suspension delivered a ride that impressed even skeptical road testers, and inside, families found real space and real comfort. Wide seats, a commanding driving position, and a dashboard that felt genuinely modern. On paper, this was the car that could have rescued British Leyland's reputation with ordinary buyers. Instead, the overhead camshaft engines developed a reputation for chronic oil leaks and troublesome timing chains that left owners visiting the garage far more often than the brochure ever suggested. Door and window seals let water seep in around the base of the windscreen, and electrical connectors buried beneath the dash corroded as a result, leading to intermittent faults that dealers struggled to diagnose. And crucially, in a market rapidly moving toward hatchbacks for practicality, the Princess never received one. Buyers loading shopping or luggage were stuck posting everything through a conventional boot lid while European rivals folded their rear seats flat and swallowed twice the load. British Leyland eventually addressed some of the mechanical issues, but by then the car's reputation had already calcified in the public imagination, and no amount of running changes could undo the damage of those first few years on the road. A genuinely talented design was undone by mechanical unreliability and a single, stubborn packaging decision that competitors had already solved years earlier. Tell us in the comments, did your family ever own a Princess, and did the styling win you over despite everything else? Number 5. Reliant Robin. The Reliant Robin occupies a strange place in British memory. More punchline than product, and yet thousands of families genuinely depended on it to get through the decade. Launched in 1973 as the successor to the long-running Regal, the Robin used a lightweight fiberglass body over a steel chassis, paired with a modest 850 cubic centimeters engine, aimed squarely at buyers looking for cheap running costs during a decade of relentless fuel price rises. On economy grounds alone, it made a defensible case for itself, and for cash-strapped families it genuinely kept them mobile when little else was affordable. Everywhere else, it struggled. The single front wheel made the car's handling genuinely unpredictable at speed, and the risk of tipping in hard cornering wasn't exaggerated by comedians. It was a real, documented hazard that owners learned to respect the hard way, often after a close call on a roundabout. The fiberglass body, while rust-proof, flexed and creaked in ways that unsettled passengers used to conventional steel cars, and panel gaps widened noticeably as the bonded joints aged. And the badge itself became a target. Taxi drivers, comedians, and rival manufacturers all found easy material in a car that had been designed, quite sincerely, to solve a real problem for real families. The cruelest part of the story is that many owners genuinely loved their Robins, defending them fiercely against the jokes, because for the price of running one, nothing else on the market kept them mobile through the fuel crisis years. It became a national joke that its owners had never asked to be part of. Number 4. Triumph Dolomite Sprint. Few cars on this list had more genuine promise than the Triumph Dolomite Sprint, and few squandered it so completely. Arriving in 1973 with a 16-valve, 2.0-liter engine that was genuinely advanced for a British family saloon of its era, The Sprint produced 127 brake horsepower and performance that embarrassed rivals, costing considerably more. Journalists praised it without reservation. Showroom crowds gathered specifically to see it, and for a brief moment, Triumph looked like it had finally cracked the formula everyone else had been chasing. Then owners discovered the cylinder head was fragile, prone to cracking under the kind of sustained heat any daily commute could produce, especially in stop-start traffic where cooling airflow dropped. The gearbox, never designed with this much power in mind, struggled to cope and developed notchy, unreliable shifts within the first year of hard use. And the body rusted at a rate that suggested anti-corrosion treatment had simply been skipped on the production line to save time, with bubbling paint appearing around the wheel arches before the car had even completed its first winter. Enthusiasts who'd bought the Sprint specifically for that advanced engine found themselves nursing it through repeated head gasket replacements, watching a genuinely class-leading piece of engineering slowly become a liability rather than an asset. A car marketed as sporting, refined, and forward-thinking left its owners with something fragile, expensive, and quietly falling apart beneath a genuinely brilliant engine. Number 3. Morris Marina. The Morris Marina is perhaps the most quietly resented car the entire decade produced, not hated loudly, just steadily, relentlessly disappointing, year after year. Launched in 1971 and kept in production throughout the decade, the Marina was British Leyland's answer to the Ford Cortina, a conventional, rear-wheel drive family saloon built under enormous time and budget pressure. That pressure showed in every panel. The front suspension was borrowed directly from the aging Morris Minor, a design already considered outdated a decade earlier, and it showed in vague, wandering steering that never inspired confidence at motorway speeds. Body quality was poor even by the standards of the era, and rust set in faster than owners had been led to expect, often appearing first around the headlamp surrounds and front wings. Contemporary motoring journalists were rarely kind, and sales figures eventually caught up with the reviews. The Marina became a symbol, fairly or not, of British Leyland's struggle to produce a genuinely competitive mainstream family car, at exactly the moment competition from Ford and the first wave of Japanese imports was intensifying. Families who bought one expecting Cortina-level dependability instead got a car that reminded them, every single week, of exactly what they hadn't received. What made the Marina's failure so persistent was simply its longevity. A car with genuine flaws that stayed in production for a single model year might be forgiven as a misstep. The Marina soldiered on for the better part of a decade, meaning an entire generation of new drivers formed their first impression of British Leyland from behind its wheel. Would you have trusted this with your family's safety on the motorway? Many owners ask themselves that question, usually too late to do anything about it. Number 2. Austin Allegro. This is the story we promised you at the start. The Austin Allegro didn't just rust badly, though it certainly did that. It didn't just handle awkwardly, though critics noted that too. The Allegro became infamous for something far stranger and far more alarming. It could genuinely start coming apart around its own passengers. Launched in 1973 as the replacement for the beloved 1100/1300 range, the Allegro arrived with British Leyland's marketing machine promising modern, practical, comfortable family motoring. What buyers actually got began with the styling, a bulbous, rounded shape that earned cruel nicknames almost the moment it appeared in showrooms, and the notorious Cortex steering wheel, a squared-off design with rounded corners that the press mocked relentlessly and that many owners quietly swapped out the first chance they got. But the real horror story was structural. The Allegro's bodyshell had nowhere near the torsional rigidity engineers had assumed it would have, and in a flaw that became genuinely notorious across the industry, incorrectly jacking up the car, something any owner might do changing a tire on the roadside, could flex the body enough to pop the rear windscreen clean out of its rubber seal. Not crack it. Not chip it. Push it out entirely, leaving a stunned family staring at a hole where their back window used to be. Hydraulic suspension units lost pressure with frustrating regularity, doors refused to close properly after even minor knocks, and interior trim panels worked themselves loose over rough roads until the whole cabin rattled like a car twice its age. Consumer groups tested it and raised serious safety concerns. Fleet buyers, who bought in bulk and talked to each other, walked away in large numbers. Private buyers felt genuinely deceived by a marketing campaign that had promised modern engineering and delivered a car that could fail structurally in a supermarket car park. Word of the exploding rear window spread quickly through workplaces and social clubs, and it became the kind of story people told at dinner tables long after they'd stopped owning the car, the detail that stuck when everything else about the decade had started to blur. Here was a vehicle that should have secured British Leyland's future in the family segment. Instead, it became one of the clearest examples of a car that, quite literally, fell apart. Number 1. Rover SD1. Number 1 belongs to a car that committed the single most unforgivable crime possible in the automotive world. It promised genuine greatness, delivered it for a few dazzling months, and then failed at almost every stage that followed. The Rover SD1 launched in 1976 to extraordinary excitement. It won European Car of the Year in 1977. Its dramatic fastback styling drew open comparisons to Italian exotics costing 3 or 4 times as much. The 3500 V8 engine offered performance the British executive class had rarely experienced from a domestic manufacturer. Journalists were euphoric. Showroom queues genuinely formed outside dealerships, with some buyers waiting months just for the privilege of placing an order. Then the cars reached buyers' driveways, and the euphoria collapsed almost immediately. Paint blistered and peeled within months of delivery. Electrical systems failed without warning, sometimes stranding drivers mid-journey with no clear cause the dealer could identify. Assembly line workers later admitted, in interviews given years afterward, that bolts were routinely left unfitted because the production schedule left no time to thread them properly. Strikes halted deliveries for months at a stretch, leaving customers who'd already paid deposits waiting half a year for cars that then arrived with misaligned panels and windows that popped open spontaneously in car parks. Motoring journalists who had crowned it Car of the Year found themselves writing follow-up pieces just months later, publicly walking back their praise as warranty claims piled up faster than dealers could process them. It was a remarkable, almost unprecedented reversal of fortune for a single model, and it happened in full public view, in real time, in a way none of British Leyland's other failures quite managed. Here was a car that could genuinely have saved Rover's reputation for a generation. Instead, it became the single most spectacular and heartbreaking failure of the entire decade, proof that even Britain's best engineering couldn't survive its worst factory floor. The 1970s left deep, lasting scars on British motoring, and behind every single car on this list sat thousands upon thousands of ordinary families, hard-working people who saved carefully for years, who trusted completely in a badge their fathers and grandfathers had trusted before them, and who drove home something that would go on to test their patience for years on end, rather than ever earning their loyalty in return. Some of these manufacturers never fully recovered from the reputational damage that followed. The whispers about reliability, about rust, about parts that simply refused to fit properly, followed these brands for decades afterward, long after the factories that built them had changed hands or closed altogether. Some of these failures were never properly acknowledged by the companies responsible for them, quietly buried in annual reports and internal memos rather than owned up to publicly. And some of the engineers who worked on these cars, talented, often brilliant men, spent decades afterward defending decisions they were never truly given the time, the resources, or the budget to make properly in the first place, carrying the blame for problems that were, in truth, born in the boardroom rather than the drawing office. But the decade also produced genuine brilliance, real innovation, and unmistakable flashes of engineering courage alongside every single disaster on this list. The same industry that let bolts go unfitted on the SD1, that let cars roll off the line with faults that should never have passed inspection, also produced suspension systems, packaging solutions, and clever engineering compromises that rivals abroad spent years afterward trying to copy, study, and understand. That tension, genuine talent, repeatedly undone by circumstance, strikes, underinvestment, and rushed deadlines, is exactly what makes this era so endlessly compelling to revisit, even now, 50 years later. If there's one single thread running through everything you've just heard, it's this. Almost none of these failures came from a lack of ideas, a lack of vision, or a lack of talent. British engineers in the 1970s were, time and time again, genuinely ahead of their competitors on paper. Better packaging, clever suspension geometry, more advanced and efficient engines, ideas that in many cases predicted where the rest of the industry would eventually end up. What they consistently, tragically lacked was the time, the funding, and the industrial stability needed to actually finish what they'd started, to properly test it, and to build it the way it deserved to be built. That gap between ambition and execution is the real story of British family motoring in this decade, and it's a far richer, far more interesting story than simple incompetence would ever have been. So, which car on today's list frustrated you the most? Let us know down in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more.